Hi, this is Stephen Sindoni, and you're watching Hollow Earth Exposed live stream number one. And I'm a longtime Hollow Earth researcher, and I decided I want to do a live stream show tonight and share with you some interesting information. Tonight's show, I'm going to put the spotlight on Norwegian sailor Olaf Jansen, who spent 28 years in prison for claiming he spent 2 years with inhabitants of the inner world, and the individuals there were 12 feet tall. I kid you not. This is one of the greatest stories never told, and the information can be found in a book entitled The Smoky God, written by Willis George Emerson. And I'm going to begin by playing a short excerpt from the book, and then I will go into the next video, which will share with you my research as to what I learned after reading the book and following the clues from the legend. So I'm going to roll that clip right now.
In this broadcast, you'll hear a true account of the Norwegian sailor Olaf Jansen, who explains how his sloop sailed through an entrance to the Earth's interior at the North Pole. For 2 years, Jansen lived with the inhabitants of an underground network of colonies who, Emerson writes, were a full 12 feet tall and whose world was lit by a smoky central sun. Their capital city was said to be the original Garden of Eden. While Emerson does not use the name Agartha, later works such as Agartha, Secrets of the Subterranean Cities, have identified the civilization Jansen encountered with Agartha. Olaf Jansen and his father were Norwegian fishermen in the 1800s who, according to their religious mythologies of Odin and Thor, believed in a land beyond the north wind that is populated by a race of giants and is evergreen and lush. On one of their journeyings to Franz Joseph Land to gather some ivory, they decided, under the favorable weather conditions, to journey to this unseen land of their forefathers and view it once and for all with their own eyes. The Smoky God catalogues their journey to this hidden land and their dealings with the giant race that inhabits it. It describes the language, culture, and lifestyles of these beings that exist in the marvelous land of perpetual sunlight. Read the Smoky God yourself and discover what remains to this day a great unseen mystery. I will now read excerpts of the Smoky God, written by Willis George Emerson. It is as notable as any early story about an underground civilization you'll ever hear. My name is Olaf Jansen. I am a Norwegian, although I was born in the little seafaring Russian town of Uleborg on the eastern coast of the Gulf of Bothnia, the northern arm of the Baltic Sea. My parents were on a fishing cruise in the Gulf of Bothnia and put into this Russian town of Uleborg at the time of my birth, being the 27th day of October of 1811. My father, Jens Jansen, was born in Rodvik on the Scandinavian coast near the Lofoten Islands, but after marrying made his home at Stockholm because my mother's people resided in that city. When 7 years old, I began going with my father on his fishing trips along the Scandinavian coast. Early in life, I displayed an aptitude for books, and at the age of 9 years old was placed in a private school in Stockholm, remaining there until I was 14. After this, I made regular trips with my father on all fishing voyages. My father was a man nearly 6 feet 3 in height and weighed over 15 stone, a typical Norseman of the most rugged sort and capable of more endurance than any other man I have ever known. He possessed the gentleness of a woman in tender little ways, yet his determination and willpower were beyond description. His will admitted of no defeat. I was in my 19th year when we started on what proved to be our last trip as fishermen, and which resulted in a strange story that shall be given to the world, but not until I have finished my earthly pilgrimage. I dare not allow the facts as I know them to be published while I am living for fear of further humiliation, confinement, and suffering. First of all, I was put in irons by the captain of the whaling vessel that rescued me, for no other reason than that I told the truth about the marvelous discoveries made by my father and myself. but this was far from being the end of my tortures. After 4 years and 8 months' absence, I reached Stockholm only to find my mother had died the previous year and the property left by my parents in the possession of my mother's people, but it was at once made over to me. All might have been well had I erased from my memory the story of our adventure and of my father's terrible death. Finally, one day I told the story in detail to my uncle Gustav Osterland, a man of considerable property, and urged him to fit out an expedition for me to make another voyage to the strange land. At first, I thought he favored my project. He seemed interested and invited me to go before certain officials and explain to them, as I had to him, the story of our travels and discoveries. Imagine my disappointment and horror when, upon the conclusion of my narrative, certain papers were signed by my uncle, and without warning I found myself arrested and hurried away to dismissal and fearful confinement in a madhouse where I remained for 28 years. Long, tedious, frightful years of suffering. I never ceased to assert my sanity and to protest against the injustices of my confinement. Finally, on the 17th of October, 1862, I was released. My uncle was dead, and the friends of my youth were now strangers. Indeed, a man of over 50 years old, whose only known record is that of a madman, has no friends. I was at a loss to know what to do for a living, but instinctively turned towards the harbor where fishing boats in great numbers were anchored, and within a week I had shipped with a fisherman by the name of Jan Hansen, who was starting on a long fishing cruise to the Lofoten Islands. Here my earlier years of training proved of the very greatest advantage, especially in enabling me to make myself useful. That was but the beginning of other trips, and by frugal economy I was, in a few years, able to own a fishing brig of my own. For 27 years thereafter, I followed the sea as a fisherman, 5 years working for others, and the last 22 for myself. During all these years, I was a most diligent student of books, as well as a hard worker at my business, but I took great care not to mention to anyone the story concerning the discoveries made by my father and myself. Even at this late day, I would be fearful of having anyone see or know the things I am writing, and the records and maps I have in my keeping. When my days on earth are finished, I shall leave maps and records that will enlighten and, I hope, benefit mankind. The memory of my long confinement with maniacs and all the horrible anguish and sufferings are too vivid to warrant my taking further chances. In 1889, I sold out my fishing boats and found I had accumulated a fortune quite sufficient to keep me the remainder of my life. I then came to America. For a dozen years my home was in Illinois near Batavia, where I gathered most of the books in my present library, though I brought many choice volumes from Stockholm. Later I came to Los Angeles, arriving here March 4th, 1901, the date I will remember as it was President McKinley's second inauguration day. I bought this humble home and determined, here in the privacy of my own abode, sheltered by my own vine and fig tree, and with my books about me, to make maps and drawings of the new lands we had discovered, and also to write the story in detail from the time my father and I left Stockholm until the tragic event that parted us in the Antarctic Ocean. I will remember that we left Stockholm in our fishing sloop on the 3rd day of April 1829 and sailed to the southward, leaving Gotland Island to the left and Åland Island to the right. A few days later we succeeded in doubling Sandemar Point, and we made our way through the sound which separates Denmark from the Scandinavian coast. In due time we put in at the town of Kristiansand, where we rested 2 days, and then started around the Scandinavian coast to the westward, bound for the Lofoten Islands. My father was in high spirits because of the excellent and gratifying returns he had received from our last catch by marketing at Stockholm instead of selling at one of the seafaring towns along the Scandinavian coast. He was especially pleased with the sale of some ivory tusks that he had found on the west coast of Franz Josef Land during one of his northern cruises the previous year, and he expressed the hopes that this time we might again be fortunate enough to load our little fishing sloop with ivory instead of cod, herring, mackerel, and salmon. We put in Hammerfest, latitude 71 degrees and 40 minutes, for a few days' rest. Here we remained 1 week, laying in an extra supply of provisions and several casks of drinking water, and then sailed towards Spitzbergen. For the first few days we had an open sea and a favoring wind, and then we encountered much ice and many icebergs. A vessel larger than our own fishing sloop could not possibly have threaded its way along the labyrinth of icebergs or squeezed through barely open channels. These monster bergs presented an endless succession of crystal palaces, of massive cathedrals and fantastic mountain ranges, grim and sentinel-like, immovable as some towering cliff of solid rock, standing silent as a sphinx, resisting the restless waves of a fretful sea. After many narrow escapes, we arrived at Spitzenberg on the 23rd of June and anchored at Wijade Bay, coasted along.
Here in front of the entrance to the genealogy department, and here's where we're going to start our investigation. We're going to start to find out, was there really a man by the name of Olaf Jansen? So let's see what we can find out. Shall we? I'll begin our search by heading to the genealogy department, where I will look through border crossings, birth records, death records, and any information that can be found from the clues that I have received reading the book, The Smoky God, A Voyage to the Inner World, in part 1 of the author's foreword, written by Willis George Emerson. So who was this elderly 95-year-old Norwegian sailor living in Los Angeles for the past 6 years, who had spent over a dozen years in the Midwest before emigrating from Sweden, that summoned author Willis George Emerson to his home at 2 o'clock in the morning to share his personal story before crossing over in January of 1908. Olaf Jansen was a Norwegian born in a little seafaring Russian town of Uleborg in the eastern coast of the Gulf of Bothnia, the northern arm of the Baltic Sea. Olaf's parents were on a fishing cruise in the Gulf of Bothnia and put into this Russian town of Uleborg at the time of his birth on the 27th of October in 1811. Olaf's father's name was Jens Jansen and was born at Rodwig on the Scandinavian coast near the Lofoten Islands, but after marrying made his home at Stockholm in Sweden. In 1825, at the age of 14, Olaf made regular trips with his father on all fishing voyages. At the age of 19, on the 3rd day of April in the year of 1829, Olaf's voyage to the inner world would begin. He and his father sailed from Stockholm, Sweden, bound for the Lofoten Islands. As luck would have it, the lure of the northern lights, the aurora borealis, caused Olaf and his father to chart a course towards the North Pole. After spending 2 years with the giant inhabitants from the inner world, Olaf and his father were homesick. It was time to set sail and return home. But they had to pass through treacherous waters to get there. It was during the return trip that the sloop capsized and Olaf's father, Jens, was swallowed up by the sea. Not long after, Olaf was picked up by a whaling ship named the Arlington, commanded by Captain Angus McPherson. Upon telling his story to the captain, of the whaling ship about the marvelous discoveries made by Olaf and his father, he was put in irons. Returning to Sweden, he had been absent 4 years and 8 months. The year now was 1835. He was told his mother had died the previous year. Upon his return, the property left by his parents were given back to him. Not long after telling the story in detail to his uncle Gustav Osterlund, a man of considerable property, Olaf urged him to help fund an expedition to make another voyage back to the strange land. At first, his uncle Gustav favored his project. Gustav seemed interested and invited Olaf to go before certain officials and explain to them, as he had to Gustav, the story of his travels and discoveries. Could you imagine Olaf's horror and disappointment upon the conclusion of his narrative that papers were signed by his uncle Gustav, and without warning, Olaf found himself arrested and confined to a madhouse where he remained for 28 long years of suffering? Finally, on the 17th day of October in the year of 1862, at the age of 51 years old, Olaf was released. Returning home, Olaf learned that his uncle Gustav was now dead and the friends of his youth were all gone. Olaf, faced with the reality of being a middle-aged man with the only known record of his existence, was that of a madman. Picking up the pieces of his shattered life, Olaf instinctively turned towards the harbor where fishing boats in great numbers were anchored, and within a week, Olaf had shipped out with a fisherman by the name of Jan Hansen, who was starting out on a long fishing cruise to the Lofoten Islands. In only a matter of a short few years, Olaf was able to own a fishing brig of his own. For 27 years, Olaf followed the sea as a fisherman, 5 years working for others, and the last 22 years for himself. In the year 1889, Olaf sold his fishing boats and found that he had accumulated a fortune quite sufficient to allow him to retire and spend the remaining years of his life in America. For a dozen years, Olaf made his home in Chicago, Illinois. He then spent the last 7 years of his life in Los Angeles, California, arriving there on March 4th of the year 1901. Then, in his latter years, just before he was ready to die, he told his story about the strange land, leaving maps and drawings to an author named Willis George Emerson. The first question I asked myself, was there any record of Olaf's birth? I was unable to find any birth records. The reason being, Olaf was not born at home. He was born on a fishing trip in a foreign country, Russia. The second question, was there any records of Olaf Jansen entering the United States? No records were found in any of my searches in a New York public library. Yet I knew that Olaf Jansen had left his homeland and traveled on a ship to Ellis Island and docked in New York City with all of the immigrants entering America. The third question I asked of myself, was there any records of Olaf Jansen being in Chicago, Illinois? The answer was yes. I was able to find an address and information that confirmed that yes, indeed, Olaf Jansen had arrived and was living in Chicago, Illinois, and the date coincided with the information in Willis George Emerson's author foreword. And there it was, a stroke of good fortune. On the 1892 City of Chicago, Northern District of Illinois Record and Index of Persons Registered of Poll List of Voters on the 5th line was the record for Olaf Jansen. His address, 304 Stephenson Street. Born in Norway, listed as being in America for 3 years, and living in Chicago for 3 years, just as the author Willis George Emerson had written in the book The Smoky God. Then search for the 1890 census to see if Olaf Jansen could be found on the 1890 census. An interesting sidebar here, I will note that the 1890 census records are not available. I then asked myself, why were the 1890 census records unavailable? I learned that the 11th U.S. Census that was taken on June 2nd of 1890, and most of the 1890 census was destroyed in 1921 during a fire in the basement of the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C. An interesting fact is that the 1890 census was the first to be compiled using a machine-readable medium, using punch cards and tabulated by machine, a method invented by Herman Holbrooke. The total population of 62,947,714 was announced only after 6 weeks of processing. The public reaction to this tabulation was disbelief, as it was widely believed the right answer was at least 75 million people in 1890. Almost all the population schedules were damaged in a fire in 1921, with 25% destroyed and 50% damaged by smoke and water. In December of 1932, according to standard federal record-keeping procedure at the time, the chief clerk of the Bureau of the Census sent the Librarian of Congress a list of papers to be destroyed, including the original 1890 census schedules. The librarian was asked by the Bureau to identify any records which should be retained for historical purposes, but the librarian did not accept the census records. Congress authorized destruction of that list of records on February 21, 1933, and thus the 1890 census remains were destroyed by government order by 1934 and 1935. Why would Congress order the 1890 census records to be destroyed? If there was at least 25% or more of the census available. If my estimation is correct, that would mean that at least 25 million records were destroyed. What was the government trying to hide by the destruction of the census? And all of this was done during the infamous first 100 days of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first term in office. Then I asked myself the question, was there any record of Olaf Jansen living in Los Angeles as claimed by author Willis George Emerson? The answer was yes. I found an address in the Los Angeles City Directory dated in the year of 1908. Halfway down the right page was the name of Olaf Jansen, listed living at 331 West 45th Street in California, just as author Willis George Emerson had claimed in the book. Another important question that needed to be answered, was there a record of birth or a census for Angus MacPherson in Scotland? The answer was yes. Angus MacPherson was born in 1796 in Scotland. I was able to acquire the 1841 Scotland census that was taken, which proved that Angus MacPherson at the time was 45 years old. His birth year was listed as 1796. He was born in Inverness, Scotland, and his occupation was listed as a merchant seaman. As I look back on this research, it never would have been possible had I not become fascinated by the story told by Norwegian sailor Olaf Jansen, and decided to take the time to narrate the book and upload the video to my YouTube channel. And it was fortunate for me that I was contacted by a man named Chris Baird, a fellow Hollow Earth researcher, who insisted that I try to research the life of Olaf Jansen and try to figure out if the man truly existed, or was Olaf Jansen, the man of the story, a figment of author Willis George Emerson's imagination. Are there any photos that have been taken that show of any polar openings in the North or South Pole? The answer is yes. Upon taking on this research, Chris Baird sent me these photos to share with you. The photos provide strong evidence for a hollow Earth and help validate Olaf Jansen's story. Based on the research I have shared on this video today, the evidence is very convincing.
Stephen Sindoni at the Long Island Railroad at 34th Street, and my journey ends here with the train. I want to thank you for watching the Smoky God Review. Until next time, Stephen Sindoni.
Well, we're back, and that's my research there for the Smoky God, and very interesting story. The information can be found in a book entitled The Smoky God, as I mentioned, written by Willis George Emerson. Great reading, and I'm glad I was able to share that here tonight. The research was tedious and long, but it was worthwhile. I hope I've grabbed your attention, because the mind is like a parachute. It'll only work if it's open. Is the earth hollow? Well, let's see if I can give you some more things to look at. I've got 3 more clips that I'm going to roll here, and these are all in Antarctica. This is the South Pole region. So I'll begin with the first clip here. Well, there you go. One location there. I even added the UFO, the craft going in the entrance there for you. But the face that you saw, the marking there, that was there. That is definitely there. So this is at a 16,000 foot elevation in the Transantarctic mountain range in the continent of the South Pole, yeah, Antarctica. So I've got some more convincing here. I got some more things to show you. This is probably 5 miles away from the opening that I just showed you right now. So this is a second opening here. This is a tool, Google Earth, that helped you find things, and I don't know that you'll be able to find that anymore, but it was out there, so I figured I'd show you. And there's another entrance not far away. So let me show you another entrance. Need more convincing? Okay, you got it. Well, I hope you enjoyed the program tonight. I'm enjoying it myself. This was the Hollow Earth Exposed live stream number one. hopefully I'll do another couple more in the next couple of weeks or so. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And check out my site there, the HollowEarthExposed.com site. And I also have the site on YouTube as well that I'm going to be streaming to here, which I am streaming to right now. And this show should be airing very soon. It's live now, but it'll be airing continuously after the program. So I want to thank you all for anybody who's here is watching. Hopefully you've enjoyed the program as much as I've enjoyed bringing it to you. Till next time, Stephen Sindoni signing off.